Good morning. Thank you for coming back for the second day, and Reed, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
We talked yesterday about making decisions, long-term decisions, and trying to avoid making those decisions based on fear, because when you do, you sort of decide what's least bad, not what's most good. But when I said long-term there, I really meant kind of in the scope of a couple of months or a year, like if you're trying to decide on product features. And at the end of the day tonight, at 4 o'clock, we have the closing keynote, which is Stuart Brand, who is like the greatest person in the universe. And he's going to be talking about decisions in the time scale of centuries and millennia. And I think you've written really fascinating stuff that's affected me very deeply about how to make decisions more in the scope of like a career. How do you make decisions in the scope of a year to a decade or two, and how do you make those sufficiently epic?
Yep. Well, so part of it, obviously, the first book was Startup You. Second one, more recently, was The Alliance. And part of the recognition is that you cannot, as much as some people here like chess, you can't treat it like a chess game, right? Because the world is stochastic. And so the world changes, competition changes, you change. And so you need to adopt a strategy that presumes that there's change. And change, by the way, inherently includes risk. And so the question is the natural human instinct to try to drive all of your decisions to risk-free is actually a mistake, because there is no such thing as risk-free.
Right.
That doesn't exist. So what you actually want to be is risk-intelligent. And then the question becomes is how are you risk intelligent over the long term? Because frequently people say, it's risky, who knows? Then planning for the future doesn't matter. That's crazy, right? Because the people who can invest and execute long-term plans, whether it's long-term plans in companies, long-term plans in work, long-term plans in career, is what makes that work. And so the career items had a lot to do with how do we, so the first book was how do you, the Startup View, with Ben, who I think is here somewhere in this audience, is kind of how do you think of it as an individual? Like how do you have a flexible planning framework? How do you invest in yourself? And then the Alliance, what we came to realize is that the employee relationship is broken because companies know, both companies and employees know that there's a high likelihood that an employee will get a job at a different company at some point in the future, but they're not talking to each other about it. If they don't talk to each other about it, that's essentially lies of omission. Lies of omission erode trust. So therefore, long-term planning gets a lot more difficult because people essentially distrust each other, and yet long-term planning for corporations is seriously important, and also seriously important for the employee's career. And so essentially what we said is, well, given this changeable environment by which the world changes, competition changes, company changes, you change, how do you still create a platform for trust? And we called that tours of duty.
Yeah, and that was like, that as a concept was really deeply important to me. Like that explained a lot of things. I've had a few of these moments in life where I've read something and it was something simple, and like in hindsight, it's the sort of thing where you're like, oh yeah, of course, I kind of knew that all along. But you read it, and then afterwards, everything in the world seems to be slightly in better focus than before. And one of those things was in Stuart Brand's book, when he's going to talk about tonight, when he describes the kind of the 6 layers of civilization and how they all spin together. I remember reading that 15 years ago and going like, oh, the world kind of makes sense to me. But another one that was very similar was a few months ago when I read the concept of tours of duty in the Alliance, and I was like, oh, the world kind of makes sense to me now. Yep. And it was this idea that like, yeah, you're in this weird position in a company-employee relationship where you're right, like everyone's afraid of the end of that relationship. As a company, you're afraid of people leaving. As an employee, you're not exactly sure what's going to happen, and no one really talks about it. Yep. And it's all becomes based out of fear, and you get politics, and it's just like massively counterproductive. Yep. And I remember like the way you described it made sense as like you could just treat this cleanly. You can make the best of it. You can say like, instead of thinking about, well, what if someone leaves and it's going to be terrible? You can be like, well, what if someone leaves and it's going to be awesome? Yes.
And well, part of the paradox is you are more likely to have, you almost certainly will have longer times working together when you have trust.
Right.
You only have trust when you have openness and communication.
Right.
Right. And then beyond that, while lifetime employment may be over in most contexts, lifetime relationship
Right.
is still present.
Right.
And so you begin to, because for example, one of the consequences that people don't realize is that when you have people who kind of come into a tour of duty, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, whatever the number is at your company, that means you have a huge amount of alumni out and about in the world
Right.
that have, if you've managed the relationship well,
Right.
a positive relationship with the company, which can really help you with network intelligence, it can really help you with recruiting, it can help you with a whole bunch of things if you maintain those relationships in healthy ways.
Yeah, and that was the kind of key for me. So what this idea that former employees are alumni of the company, like that's just a really elegant idea. It lets you relate to it much better. It lets you go and ask them for money every couple of years.
Yep.
It just makes the situation.
That's more universities rather than companies, but they can buy the product, whatever. But yes,
It's true. Well, yeah, but they help with recruiting. They bring
Yes.
people on. Like it's kind of huge. So what I've started telling people at Evernote since reading your book, and I don't know if they believe me or not, but I think if I repeat it enough, it'll become true. Is say, look, like I want your next job. After this job, I want your next job to be much more epic than your current one. I want you to be able to get a much better job. I want you to like level yourself up. I want you to be able to like do something much more significant than you're doing now.
Yep.
And I want your current job, your current tour of duty, to be what teaches you the skills and what qualifies you and gives you the confidence to do that.
Yep.
And I hope that next job is at Evernote.
Yes.
But I totally understand that it may not be.
Yes.
And I hope to be in a position in 2, 3, 4 years from now where I am fighting to keep you here, knowing that you can actually do something much more epic somewhere else. And if you do wind up leaving and going somewhere else, as long as you're going to a much better job,
Yep.
like I'm happy and satisfied that I've done my work.
Yes, that's the promise of career transformation, and it's fundamental.
And the fact that I never thought of it before reading your book a few months ago, like sort of made me kick myself. Like this is obviously the way to think about life.
Yeah. I think you were living it already. We just gave you a little bit of language.
Maybe. Well, the smartest things are the things that you read and you're like, oh yeah, I knew that.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.